I am the emperor's biggest mistake, or so he thinks. He threw me into the cold palace on our wedding night, disgusted by my presence. He's waiting for a woman who will never return, pining for a soul that has already crossed the bridge of the dead. He thinks I stole her life. He doesn't realize I am the only one who survived the blood-stained bridal road. One day, he will light a mountain of lamps for me, but by then, I will be as cold as the palace I lived in. When goose feather snow, wrapped around withered yellow willow leaves, drifted down into the courtyard, I had already been in the cold palace for 3 years. Jenny picked up dead twigs and fallen leaves to boil hot water. The food that came was always cold. Every time, she had to reheat it before it could be eaten. I had never imagined Jenny would be so loyal. She had followed me faithfully in Moonwatch Kingdom, and just the same when I came to the Snowstep Empire as a marriage envoy. Nor had I imagined the new emperor of Snowstep, Alexander Wang, could be so devoted. On the wedding day, the moment he saw that I was not the one he had requested, he immediately threw me into the cold palace. That day too was late autumn with falling snow. He only lifted one corner of my veil, and along the handle of the jade ruby, I saw the shock and disgust in the emperor's eyes. He said only one thing to me. "Princess Lydia, is it? Then the real Isabella Lu must be dead, and her little sister sent to be my empress in her place? One brocade, one gauze. Have you ever looked at yourself and seen what kind of thing you are?" Alexander Wang had a not yet healed scar at the corner of his eye, and when he cursed he was frightfully hideous. It made me want to fetch a mirror and hold it up so he could see what kind of thing he himself was. Of course I didn't dare. I could only fall silent, kneel and confess guilt, then obediently move into the cold palace. For a brand new empress to enter the cold palace in her wedding gown, within the 5 kingdoms, I was probably the first in history. I could not have said whether fear, sadness, or helplessness was stronger in me that night. On that snow-slicked bluestone road, I did feel a faint trace of pity in my heart. Only a faint trace. The imperial capital of Moonwatch Kingdom lay 1,000 li from this cold peak city. Messages on the road would take time, so he did not know that the angry words he had just flung at me were, in fact, the truth. I came under the title Princess Isabella to marry in her stead, because the real Isabella Lu was indeed already dead. By my reckoning, it would have been about a month and a half after I departed the palace. When she died, she must have bled from all 7 orifices, a young life in full bloom, dying with eyes wide open. By rights, I ought to have remained as ignorant as Alexander Wang was. Only, it was I who had poisoned Isabella Lu to death. My own elder sister, killed by the Lickies, her own hands and blood, had offered up her favorite food on a mid-autumn night of family reunion. When I left the palace, everyone said that I had stolen my elder sister's favor and snatched for myself the honor of becoming empress of a foreign land. Speaking of Isabella Lu, as Alexander Wang had said, "One brocade, one gauze," that phrase perfectly summed up the lives of the 2 of us sisters. She was always the one cradled in our emperor father and our imperial mother's palms, the brightest little princess in the whole palace. Even when she had no choice but to be married off in alliance, she was still the beloved of Alexander Wang, who then held the northern marches. And I was different. From birth, I was not as pretty as Isabella Lu. From as early as I could remember, all I could do was watch while our imperial mother held her. Gradually, even the wet nurse didn't like to lay hands on me. Our emperor father doted most on my imperial mother, so naturally he doted on Isabella Lu as well. And our imperial mother's coolness toward me grew heavier by the year. Let alone the princes, princesses, and servants in the palace. All of them used to judging people by their status. When I was very young, I used to pull Jenny aside and tell her, "Look, you're made of plain cloth, and I'm gauze, but only she is brocade and embroidery beyond compare. So really, you and I ought to be the real sisters." She would wave her hands in panic, saying my body was as precious as gold and I shouldn't compare myself to a lowly servant like her. A few years later, a sweeping maidservant even dared to mutter in front of my bedchamber that I was too withdrawn. No wonder no one liked me. In my heart I thought, wasn't it you palace people who made me like this? What person is different from the very moment they're born? If I had grown up, like Isabella Lu, loved by thousands, my temper might even have been better than hers. That year, just shy of 11, I shut the door and vented to Jenny. If Mother only had me under her knee, things would surely be different. Jenny was always honest and simple. She only nodded stupidly and said, if there were no Princess Isabella, Princess Lydia's situation would indeed be much better. It was only after she'd said it that she realized she'd spoken wrong, and hurriedly added that she hadn't meant to say Isabella Lou was bad, or that I was unfortunate now. She added many more words, but none hit the true point. It wasn't a question of who was good or bad. It was simply that our Emperor Father and Imperial Mother had always been partial. Between one person and another, favoritism is the least reasonable thing of all. With Isabella Lou's favor, she should have been able to live out her days by the Emperor Father's side in Bright Moon Palace, marry a consort of her own choosing, and the children she bore would have been rich and noble, without doubt. But 3 years ago, when Alexander Wang was still the elder prince of Snowsteppe, he came with the delegation to discuss ending the war. In the rear garden, he happened to run into Isabella Lou, who was insisting on learning to ride a peasant girl's swing. I was not present, but later I heard the gossiping maids say that Isabella Lou had even invited Alexander Wang to play along, and personally pushed him on the swing. When it flew too high and someone pushed him out, he fell into the flower beds and even got his face scratched by the branches. Yet Alexander Wang was not angry. At the sight of Isabella Lou's frightened beauty, he could only stand there and smile like a fool. After that, he deliberately inquired after her and learned that she was Princess Isabella, under the knee of Lady Yu. At the time, Snowsteppe was powerful, intent on swallowing the entire northern marches. They had driven our Moonwatch kingdom back and back again. Their armies were nearly at the gates of Bright Moon City when our Emperor Father finally panicked and sent a letter of surrender to negotiate peace. Not only did we have to cede land and pay gold and silver, we also had to send a princess in marriage to seal the alliance. Thus, no matter what, Alexander Wang insisted that Isabella Lou be the one to come. Our Emperor Father and Imperial Mother could not bear to let her go. On the pretext of choosing an auspicious date, they delayed until the following summer. Alexander Wang had already ascended the throne as the new Emperor of Snowsteppe, and wrote that if no princess was sent at once, it would mean swords drawn and bows bent. Only then were they forced to confirm the alliance marriage. At that season, the lychees from Jiangnan were just right, but the tribute fruit sent to the palace each year was limited. The most that ever reached my hands was 7 or 8. Even when Isabella Lou said she loved lychees most, and I quietly echoed her, I could never get the big white porcelain bowl that was heaped for her. Sometimes the share she rewarded to her chief maid Ivy had more fruits than mine. Last year was worst, 5 more lychees than I got. Ivy, relying on her mistress's favor, had the nerve to give exactly 5 lychees to Jenny, saying in a sing-song, mocking tone, "I dare say your mistress can't give you this many." Jenny knew I loved lychees. Stupid as ever, she came back hugging them all and tried to give them to me. Angry and humiliated, I swept the fruits to the floor in one motion. But after staring at them for a long time, I bent down and picked them up one by one. I didn't wash or wipe them. I peeled them and put them into my mouth, dust and all, stuck to my fingertips. Jenny burst into tears then. When I asked her why she was crying, she stammered for a long time and only asked in return, "Then why is the princess laughing?" I realized she'd been frightened into tears by the sight of me. But that year, all the lychees sent to my Imperial Mother's palace ended up in my bedchamber. I peeled and ate them one by one, and even eating them as meals, I could not finish them all. Our Emperor Father came to see me in person, and besides the Crown Prince, he took only me, among all his daughters, to Snowhall Pavilion to escape the heat. Soft moonlight poured in from the window. The gentle expression on his face then was something he had never before given me. After a while, I heard him laugh softly. "Since when has my little Lydia grown so tall and graceful? In my memory, you were always that quiet child standing by the table, copying characters. Now you're already more than half a head taller than the desk." My nose burned. I hurriedly turned my back to him and only looked out at the moon over the treetops. "Since when?" "I had grown up in front of you, day by day." If you ask me, since when, I truly do not know how to answer. In Isabella Lu's bedchamber, there was a tall, green jade screen. Every mid-autumn night, our emperor father and imperial mother would measure her height and carve it into that screen. I don't think our emperor father ever wondered when Isabella had grown up. Lydia has always been quiet and seldom speaks, afraid to cause worry to your emperor father and imperial mother. If you can save us trouble, that in itself is your good fortune. I turned back with the timid smile they were used to seeing and curtsied sweetly. It was the first time he had ever praised me. From childhood to then, even though in reading, etiquette, needlework I had done better than Isabella Lu, I had never once earned a word of praise. Back then, angered, one day I had deliberately embroidered a phoenix as a green sparrow and handed it in, only to have my imperial mother set it aside without a glance. I ran back to my room crying and realized that more than scolding, I feared their indifference. No matter what I did, it seemed none of it mattered to them. I was their legitimate flesh and blood, and yet I truly did not matter. So that night in Snowhall Pavilion, I looked up and asked our emperor father a question that Princess Lydia by all rights would never dare ask. Emperor father, if I go in elder sister's place and marry an alliance, would that not also be a good thing? When he heard that I was willing to go in Isabella Lu's stead, I caught a flash of joy in our emperor father's eyes. It was only an instant, but that was enough. After that, no matter how many lofty words he said about how he could not bear to let me go, not one of them could move me to tears again. In truth, I hadn't needed to ask. The way they had been treating me those days, so overly good, was certainly because they wanted something. At the time, there was nothing else to weigh against except the troublesome matter of Isabella's marriage alliance. The day before I was to leave, I saw only one person, my elder sister, Isabella Lu. She was the sort of girl you could read at a glance. She was like the full moon over Bright Moon City. Grown up, nourished by 10,000 kinds of favor, without a shadow in her eyes. I invited her to my bedchamber. When she had fewer playmates as a child, she often came. Later, seeing how cool my reactions were, she came less and less. Now she sat beside the round table, biting her lip, not daring to look at me. Her gaze was fixed on the plate of lychees. I peeled one for her with my own hands. She took it slowly and after much hesitation asked me, "I heard, you volunteered?" "Yes," I answered lightly. I waited for her to put the fruit into her mouth, then peeled another for her. "Sister need not blame yourself. To share the worries of our emperor father, imperial mother, and elder sister is what Lydia ought to do." She ate the second one more quickly. Tears brimmed in her limpid autumn eyes on that flawless lotus-pale face, making her all the more pitiful to look at. "You've always been the most obedient little sister in the palace. I truly can't bear to part with you." That "can't bear" from Isabella Lu's mouth was probably the only thing that came from her heart. For a moment, I held many flavors in my heart. My hand paused over the lychees, but in the end I still handed her another and stuffed it into her mouth without giving her a say. I think I heard my own habitual false laugh. I can't bear to part with elder sister either, but sister has always feared the cold. If you really went to the far north to snowstep, I'd be even less willing to let you go. Sister, don't worry. Seeing me peel yet another lychee for her, she hurriedly told me to eat some too. I watched her. On that skin, like congealed cream, was a pure, sincere expression that had no business existing in this icy deep palace. Softly, I said, "I don't really like lychees. I don't know why Imperial Mother rewarded me with so many this year. Since you love them best, sister, you should eat more while you're here." "Really?" Isabella Lu swallowed the fruit and widened her eyes. In them was reflected the dark silhouette of me, sitting with my back to the light, like a bloodless shadow. "How can anyone not love lychees?" "Well then, it's just as well. If you ended up in Snowstep and wanted them, you'd never get to eat them anyway." She sighed deeply, speaking with utter earnestness for my sake. Yes, how could anyone not love lychees? How could anyone not hear the words spoken right beside her? I'd left so many holes in my story, and she hadn't noticed one. Chanting inwardly, "Isabella Lu, you deserve to die stupid," I placed the last lychee into her palm. 5 in all, exactly how many your servant once gave my servant. Now I simply return them to you, one for one. The poison was made from venomous snakes, insects, rats, and ants. Dissolved in water, it soaked into the fruit. Only if I was the one who asked would those apothecary servants in the imperial pharmacy believe that there were vermin in a princess's chambers. I had asked carefully what would happen if someone accidentally ingested it. One of the servants pinched up a small packet and said that in small doses, nothing much would happen, but in sufficient amount, not even the greatest immortal could save them. They would die bleeding from every orifice. That night, Isabella Lou began suffering abdominal pain that would not stop. At dawn, when I was brought over for questioning, I saw her through the bead curtain. Her face had already turned corpse pale. Even like that, she was a beauty. The imperial physicians said there was no hope of recovery, that at best she could linger for a month and a half. It was Ivy who reported me, saying that the previous day she had only eaten a few extra lychees in my chambers. I fell to my knees at once and knocked my head on the floor. My voice was low and steady. If our Emperor Father and Imperial Mother have doubts, then confine Lydia and investigate thoroughly. Only, if it delays the alliance and Snowstep raises troops against us again, Lydia will be guilty of a crime beyond forgiveness. I had not expected our Imperial Mother to fling herself at me like a madwoman and seize my shoulders. I raised my head and met her tear-red eyes. That is your blood sister. No matter how you resent your Emperor Father and me for favoring her, you shouldn't have struck such a cruel blow. Taking in all the undisguised hatred and loathing in her gaze, I oddly enough almost wanted to laugh. I didn't bother to hide anymore. Turning to that ruler of a kingdom, I asked, "Emperor Father, how do you intend to decide?" The kingdom came before the family. I saw his fist clench and unclench before he finally released it in exhaustion and told me to hurry onto the bridal cart and leave the palace, not to miss the auspicious hour. My Imperial Mother plucked a sparrow-shaped hairpin from a maid's head and pinned it in my hair. By old rights, it should have been a phoenix pin she had prepared long ago. I understood what she meant. "I hope you die badly." On the road north, that was the last thing my mother ever said to me. The northern wind swept the land, white grass bent and snapped. I could no longer cry. I had soaked too many pillows in tears over the years because of their favoritism. I could only think of one thing, so they did know they were partial. They knew, and they knew I would bear a grudge. But because I was only a neglected princess with no power and no influence, they couldn't be bothered with my grievances. Even the rare scraps of attention were all for the sake of Isabella Lou's bright, smooth life. Sitting in the bridal cart, I smoothed my crimson wedding robes. If Jenny outside, riding with the escort, could see me then, she would probably be frightened into tears again. Because whenever I thought of how they would spend the rest of their lives in torment, knowing they had driven Isabella Lou to her death through me, I could not help but laugh. Die badly? If harming a kind and innocent person means one will die a bad death, then how many of us are bound for such an end? Even then, I did not yet understand that there are people who should have had a peaceful end, but choose to jump into the 10 hells of their own accord. Even if they are doomed not to die well, they will not retreat, and they will not regret it. The whole way north, my heart was uneasy. I analyzed things with Jenny. Even if Alexander Wang learned I was not Isabella Lou, I still came to Snowstep as Empress under Princess Isabella's name, representing the peace between two kingdoms. He couldn't lightly take my life. Our Emperor Father must have weighed it similarly to send me in Isabella's place. Jenny tried to comfort me, saying that made sense, and perhaps Alexander Wang would even treat me kindly. Emperors were always fickle. Where were there such clear-cut lines between love and hate? Snow fell in goose-feather flakes. Autumn in the northern desert was already as cold as midwinter in Bright Moon City. I pulled my cloak closer, lifted a corner of the carriage curtain, and glanced at Jenny. "Tell me, are you bold or timid? You know Isabella Lou was killed by me. Aren't you afraid of me?" Outside the window, Jenny turned her head toward me. I was shaken by the pity in her eyes. Only I know how pitiful the princess is. Even if you killed someone, the princess is still very pitiful, isn't she? If she hadn't added that I was pitiful because I had to come marry into this desolate north, I might have been startled that she could see into my heart. It's true, I thought. If only I had killed the right person, it would have washed away old humiliations. But I couldn't kill my emperor father and imperial mother. I suddenly began to think seriously about that. Perhaps it wasn't that I didn't want to kill my parents. It was just that compared to foolish Isabella, with lax guards, the emperor and an imperial consort were too difficult to get at. After that, I was thrown into the cold palace. And after that, word came. Because my identity was delicate now, Moonwatch Kingdom sent a message saying that Princess Lydia had died of illness. Perhaps to our emperor father and imperial mother, that was the truth. That quiet, timid Lydia had in fact died the night she poisoned her own sister. It was also the second time I laid eyes on Alexander Wang. In the driving snow, he stood only at the doorway and asked if the dead Princess Lydia was the same person as Isabella Liu. Wearing a robe of blazing red, he stood in the snow like a plume of leaping fire. I couldn't see his expression clearly. I only nodded. When I left the palace, she was already gravely ill in bed. Afraid of delaying the alliance, they replaced her with me at the last moment. Lydia Liu, do you know that I would rather have received Isabella Liu's corpse than see you come instead? So even from a stranger's mouth, those words could cut to the bone. I bowed low. The floor tiles of the cold palace were icy to the marrow. I tried my best to make my "please leave" sound more polite. The cold palace is damp and chill. If you have no further business, you should leave quickly. If you catch cold and damage your body, my guilt would be beyond forgiveness. Perhaps no concubine from the cold palace had ever driven an emperor away before. He stared at me several times, then flicked his sleeves and left. He did not return for 3 whole years. I had thought I would grow old and die in the cold palace. Then the senior eunuch Henry Lee came with an edict, saying Alexander Wang was sending me back to Dawnlight Palace, the Empress's residence, to manage the rear palace and be his Empress properly. I slipped one of my most valuable gold and jade bracelets into Henry Lee's hand and asked what had happened. He accepted it without changing expression and quietly told me that my emperor father had sent another princess to be Alexander Wang's concubine. She had been sent to Alexander Wang's bed only last night, and this morning the edict releasing me from the cold palace had arrived. The one sent was Natalie Liu. Counting it properly, her imperial mother was my mother's own younger sister. When I left the palace, Natalie was only 12 or 13. My faint impression of her was a clever beauty, with the ends of her brows cocked up. I pushed the other bracelet into Henry Lee's hand. Understanding, he added, Consort Natalie also came from Moonwatch Kingdom. As soon as she arrived, she said she was thinking of you. The Emperor thought that since the two of you are sisters to begin with, you can keep each other company. It was not me she missed, but my Empress's seat. Nor did Alexander Wang want us to keep each other company. He had few concubines, apart from me and Natalie Liu, none with special status. He clearly wanted us to keep each other in check. When I stepped into Dawnlight Palace, it was evening. I stood at the highest step and turned to see the last blush of sunset sliding off the vermilion walls. Strangers, maids and eunuchs, knelt in a black mass across the courtyard, chanting, "We respectfully welcome the Empress back to the palace." Back to the palace? Once, I had thought the little courtyard I lived in inside Bright Moon Palace was my home. Now, the cold palace in Cold Peak City, where I'd lived 3 years, also felt a little like home. And now there was this Dawnlight Palace, where I had not spent even one night and where I did not know a single face. In truth, there was no difference. As if I had ever had anyone truly close, even back in Moonwatch Kingdom. Just as I was thinking this, I saw a familiar face appear at the palace gate. Natalie Liu approached me with measured grace and bowed. 3 years had passed. Her beauty had become sharper, more cutting. I greet elder sister Lydia. Jenny poured me a cup of hot tea, and seeing me still standing outside the main hall, came out holding the tray. I took hold of her wrist, and, with a casual movement, pushed the tray toward Natalie Liu. "Sister, have some tea." The last time we'd met in Bright Moon City, she'd come with her mother. Back then, I had clumsily tried to please everyone, and had grabbed a maid's job, offering her tea myself. Her expression then had been just like now, surprise with contempt hidden deep inside. "Elder sister is now the exalted empress. How can you serve tea to me, a younger sister?" Natalie Lu seized the chance to step forward and take my arm, leading me into the hall. The little maids were just about to light the lamps. In the dimness, she leaned close and spoke bluntly. "Elder sister, I see you're still the same as ever. But how does such an obedient, gentle little princess bring herself to kill her own elder sister?" My breath caught. I raised my eyes in shock. I'd never liked meeting others' eyes, because most looked at me either with disdain or with cold indifference. Natalie Lu's look was rare. It was mostly pride at having caught hold of my weakness. My hands clenched involuntarily under my wide sleeves. I only asked, "Have you told the Emperor?" The pride in her eyes faded by half. She leaned back against the chair, using a sip of tea to smooth her voice. "I have. But the Emperor has been busy with state affairs. How could he have the leisure to bother with some petty harem matter?" Alexander Wang knew Isabella Lu had been killed by me. Yet instead of coming to claim my life, he let me out of the cold palace. I slowly relaxed my fist and reached for a mandarin orange on the table. "Did my imperial mother tell you this?" The cool flesh in my mouth unexpectedly made me think of that great platter of leches. I broke off a few segments and handed them to her. Natalie's eyes flickered as she countered. If it hadn't come from someone who knew, who would dare believe such a thing? I looked away from her, letting my gaze rest on the 8-sided palace lantern by the door. The flame snapped softly behind the thin gauze shade. "Do you know how I killed Isabella Lu?" Clearly she did not. Her eyes widened, and although she tried to look aloof and proud, they were filled with doubt and fear. Just like Isabella Lu back then, she ate the orange I gave her without a second thought. Exactly like you're doing now, I turned my head and fixed my eyes on her. This time I sat facing the light, and I finally saw what I looked like reflected in her pupils. A delicate face with a timid smile like an old tree anyone could chop down. Not afraid in the least that I might have put poison in the food. She doubled over and began retching on the floor, utterly forgetting the dignity and decorum of a chief consort. After a long fit of disgrace, she realized something and clutched a maid's arm to drag herself upright, wanting to scold me for joking with her. "Elder sister, you? What place is this?" I cut her off and slowly sipped my tea. Her face flushed red and she didn't respond. Jenny answered for her. "Snow Steppe Empire. Cold Peak City. The Empress's palace." I lifted my chin a little and glanced at Natalie. "In Bright Moon City, I was indeed your elder sister. But here, I am the Empress. It's late. I intend to rest. Please return to your own palace." With a flick of my sleeve, the sharp-eyed eunuchs moved up to show her the way. I didn't need to watch to know that from this day on, there would be no more contempt in her eyes when she looked at me. Perhaps there would be panic, perhaps revulsion, but she could only bow low and pay me homage. Yes, the Empress. The north wind howled, and the night swallowed Natalie's retreating figure. It was the first time I had ever taken such delight in watching someone's back, imagining a wild beast leaping from the shadows and biting off their head in one gulp. A river of blood would spurt from the severed neck, splashing until the entire courtyard of Dawnlight Palace was dyed scarlet. After Natalie left, Jenny cheerfully poured me another cup of tea, saying that since we had both been cut loose like kites with broken strings, cast 1,000 li from home, we might as well stop stepping on each other to stay afloat. She set out dishes for me and sighed that at last we no longer had to reheat leftovers. Jenny was overjoyed. I rarely saw her face so animated, but I could not find much to smile about. It felt as if there was a bottomless hole in my heart. No matter how much I threw into it, nothing filled it up. As she laid out my bedding, she even hummed a little tune from Moonwatch Kingdom. Only then did I think to ask her, "Jenny, you've been in the palace serving me since you were 8. Where are you from originally?" "From Mooncall City in Jiangnan. There, the plum blossoms bloom in winter, and they're just lovely." I gazed at her bent back as she smoothed the quilts, looking for a long while before turning to face the Nanmu shelves lined with jade ornaments. In the glossy surface I saw my own reflection, with a phoenix crown on my head. "Jenny, then where am I from?" "Why, you are a princess of Bright Moon City, the imperial capital." At some point the sky had clouded over, snowflakes were rattling down into the night. That was the first time I smiled my hollow, painted-on smile at Jenny and said, "Wrong. I am the Empress of Snowstep Empire in the Northern Marches. She stared at me, the innocent look on her face draining away bit by bit. Her expression was exactly like the one she'd worn the day she saw me laughing while I picked lychees off the floor and ate them, eyes reddening on the verge of tears. In the end, Jenny, like Natalie, bowed low, hands shaking as she said, "The Empress, please rest." "So early, and you want me to rest already?" A man's low voice suddenly came from afar. I turned and saw a flare of fire red stepping across the threshold of the main hall, crunching over the crushed ice as he strode toward me. It was Alexander Wang. After 3 years apart, he was back, and blind in one eye. It was rare for me to see his face clearly. With his long, narrow brows and eyes, the lean bones of his cheeks, and the straight bridge of his nose over slightly full lips, he could almost be called a cold-eyed beauty, spoiled only by the black eye patch that ruined everything. Jenny poured him tea. He drank as he spoke. "How did you kill Isabella Liu?" After he swallowed, I answered calmly, "I poisoned my elder sister's food." His hand holding the cup paused for a second. Then he curled his lip. "Your method of killing is truly crude. Fortunately, the one you wanted dead was stupid enough." Anger flared up in me. I couldn't understand why a ruler had to speak so viciously. "You needn't worry too much." He suddenly leaned closer. The candle flame on the table glinted like a sesame seed in his one good eye. "I heard from consort Natalie that when Isabella Liu died, she was bleeding from all 7 orifices, so wasted she was nothing but skin over bone, and she even called your name." He clamped my chin in one hand, forcing me to meet his gaze, and rasped hoarsely, mimicking someone drawing their last breath as he whispered, "Lydia? I must say, you imitate a dying voice quite well." I looked back at him and couldn't help laughing out loud. She never liked saying my name. No one ever remembered my name. Our emperor father and imperial mother were truly cruel. Knowing she couldn't live, they still made her linger half a month in a state worse than death, so that by the time she was buried, she didn't even look like a beauty anymore. Wind and snow battered the window lattices. The northern wind roared through the hills behind Dawnlight Palace, loud enough to drown out the tinkling of dozens of Eve bells. And in that overwhelming howl, Alexander Wang suddenly bent toward me and pressed his lips onto mine. His stubble scratched, his unfamiliar scent wrapped around me and swallowed me whole. The servants in the hall withdrew. Alexander scooped me up and carried me to the brocade couch. Jenny hurried to let the bead curtain fall. He was so much stronger than I. My reflexive struggle was easily overpowered. When pain swept through me and he paused a little, he bent to my ear and teased, "Lydia, your brows are tied in a death knot." I shut my eyes, wishing for death from the pain. I spat recklessly. "Then I'd like to tie this death knot around my throat, so it can't come back out." I hadn't expected him to laugh, breath rough in my ear. "Then I'll just have to see whether you manage to keep it in tonight." The night was absurd, like a fever dream. Only after Alexander went to morning court did Jenny come to me, sobbing that there were blue-black marks all over my body and even my lips were bitten through, still beaded with blood. I licked the cut, my mind oddly blank. For some reason, although Jenny was nearly in tears, saying Alexander was surely torturing me to avenge Isabella Liu, I did not feel afraid. Because compared to Bright Moon Palace, here in Dawnlight Palace only Alexander dared hurt me. And not in some vague, indifferent way. He hated me so much he wanted to tear me apart and swallow me. How amusing. I smiled strangely again. This time Jenny didn't cry. She only turned away in a panic, seizing the excuse of fetching the meal to avoid my gaze. Except on days weighed down with state business, Alexander slept in my bed every night. I disliked speaking with him. I only snapped back when his sarcasm pushed me past my limits, and then his fingers would dig harder into my wrist. The next day, my skin would be ringed with bruises. In the end, I ordered a pair of extra-wide gold bangles made to cover the marks. The first night I wore them, Alexander yanked them off and flung them to the floor. They clattered across the tiles, striking a table leg before stopping. "Look." He dragged my wrist up in front of my eyes and grinned, baring his teeth like a little ghost in some storybook I once read. "When your sister died, her whole body was this purple-blue. Don't you dream of her coming to claim your life?" I was speechless. My sleep had always been light. I woke as soon as I began to dream, especially here in the north with the wind so loud at night. I nodded in resignation. If you simply want to see me have a good cry, just issue a decree, and I will oblige you on the spot. His laughter died away, but his lips curved higher. Now he looked even more like that little ghost from the illustrations. Suddenly, Alexander ripped off his eye patch. Skin that had gone pale from years without sun showed starkly beneath it. Where his eyes should have been, there was only a jagged scar. He even hooked a finger under his upper eyelid. We were close enough that I saw the empty socket at a glance. Under the thin skin, blood vessels webbed like bloody lines through a damp, dark hollow. I stared, a little dazed. He asked what I was thinking. I was not allowed to lie. For once I felt a hint of cruelty in myself. I lifted my forefinger and nearly poked it into that empty socket. He didn't flinch away. I heard myself say slowly, I was thinking, if I got a sharpened branch and stuck it in here, would it go straight through your head, like threading a skewer of candied haw? He sat up and laughed until he shook. I noticed then the marks the eye patch's ties had left on his face and behind his ear. It reminded me of the histories of the 5 kingdoms. More than one crown prince had been rejected because of some defect of appearance or body. I had no idea when his eye had been gouged out. 3 years ago he had not yet been named crown prince, and the old emperor of Snowsteppe had been gravely ill, on the brink of death. The Empress Dowager, his mother, was ruling from behind the curtain and should have preferred her younger son, Daniel Wang. That Alexander had finally ascended the throne must have been due to his years of military service expanding the northern borders. And what are you thinking? He lay back down, and as usual, stared into my face as if he wanted to read me through and through. I flexed my aching wrist. You should try scaring consort Natalie like this. She cries much more prettily than I do. He lowered his head, his warm lips brushed my ear, his Adam's apple bobbed as he murmured, You're calling me get lost again. When howling wind and snow rattled the windows, something in my chest seemed to slam just as hard. This man understood me too well. For some reason, I suddenly remembered the fireworks that had filled the hills around Bright Moon City on New Year's Eve. They made the little courtyard as bright as midday, even outshining the lantern festival moon. I had once told Jenny that it would be good if a person's life could be like those fireworks. Brilliant for an instant, then nothing but ground bone and ashes. Jenny had rushed to cover my mouth, terrified that some malicious soul might overhear and report me to our emperor father and imperial mother. I had laughed and pulled her hand away, saying they would never punish me for that. So a little abruptly, for the first time, I put my arms around Alexander's broad shoulders. Alex, could you have people hang some lamps on the hill, very high as the moon? He gave a short yes, surprisingly gentle, and I felt suddenly sick. Why was it that I had to beg for every shred of kindness? Why was it all like this? Natalie Lou could not keep from coming to see me once Alexander ordered 100 lamps hung on the hillside for me. To light them all, a dozen palace servants had to climb the hill 2 hours before dark every evening and sit up all night to make sure a fallen lamp didn't start a fire. Even in the height of the first month, when red hung everywhere, Dawnlight Palace was the most dazzling place of all. Natalie spoke of the talent selection scheduled for the 4th month, and I realized she had come to me with a purpose. When she couldn't secure favor, she wanted to win me over in advance. I studied her. In just a few months, the sharpness between her brows had dulled. You didn't really believe all those people back in Bright Moon Palace, did you? That you could come here and easily pick up an empress's seat that had fallen into your lap? You didn't, did you? I swallowed back most of the scorn in my voice. To think I'd once been wary of her. If it were you, what would you choose? Natalie started crying in front of me, all her former arrogance gone. If I'd refused to come to the north, I would have had to marry that so-called general of the western frontier, the one whose first wife supposedly died of his own blows. If it were you, what would you do? To pacify inside and out by marrying off daughters, we deserve to have our enemies at the capital gates. If it were me, I'd also have come north and tried my luck. I lifted my tea and sipped slowly. Steam rose, and the lamps on the mountain were beginning to wink to life. If I couldn't seduce the emperor, I'd at least cultivate a good relationship with the empress, who's still bloodkin. But in a harem that eats people and spits out no bones, to prove my loyalty, I'd at least have to promise that if I bore a prince, I'd send him to the empress to raise, in hopes that when he's made crown prince, he'll treat the empress as his own mother. Natalie stared at me, at a loss for words. Her eyes brimmed with disbelief, disappointment, and helplessness. I found it very funny and laughed softly. You never truly took me as your real elder sister. On what grounds did you think I'd treat you as a real younger sister and shelter you? I turned and looked at her, wondering if privilege had made her as stupid as Isabella in the end. Wake up! This is Cold Peak City. Inside the palace, there's no imperial mother or emperor father to spoil you. Outside, there are no ministers or maternal relatives to protect you. I'm the only person here you know. Of course, I gestured, and had them remove the screen blocking the window. The countless lamps on the mountain bathed all of Dawnlight Palace in summer bright light. I watched the specks of flame and imagined the whole hill ablaze, burning all to ash. You can always go see the others. Silence stretched long. Why see anyone else? Who knows if I can pay the price they demand? Natalie got up. The last shred of pride in her eyes went out. She knelt deeply before me. From now on, I must rely on you for protection. Her forehead struck the floor with a crisp thud. Inwardly, I marveled at how clear the sound was. In the end, it was I who conceived first. Henry Lee himself selected the best attendants for a pregnant woman and brought them to me, offering congratulations and saying that in his service to 3 emperors, he had never seen one dote on a woman so. It was true. In Alexander's harem, below me there were no noble consorts. Including Natalie, there were only 3 consorts in total, and fewer lower-ranked concubines than I could count on one hand. He had been on the throne 4 years, and the child in my belly was his first. I joked, could it be that the emperor is weary of women? Henry Lee glanced at me. Though he said, you must be joking, there was a trace of seriousness on his face. That piqued my curiosity. Or perhaps the emperor once showed his eye to some concubine and scared her to tears, and that's why he doesn't like coming to the harem? Has the emperor shown you that eye? Henry Lee looked truly startled, then smiled. There's been no such thing. The new emperor has been very busy with state affairs. He's just been delayed, that's all. We both knew I wouldn't believe that, and that no matter what more I asked, he would say nothing. It was Grace, who had once served the late Empress Dowager Charlotte Xiao, who was willing to tell me some of the old stories. She said that when the late emperor was choosing his heir, Alexander's eye was already bad. With Duke Xiao at their head, all the court officials supported Daniel. Then, by coincidence, came the spring hunt. Alexander took Daniel into deep mountains, and when they came back, Daniel had been mauled, his flesh torn. They had to amputate both legs and one arm to keep him alive at all. His lips and teeth were badly injured too. He could barely speak. At the time, the Empress Dowager of the Xiao clan was ruling behind the curtain. Her relatives held the court in their grip, and they couldn't very well raise up a son of another concubine. In the end, they had no choice but to choose Alexander as heir. The officials were all displeased at having a one-eyed emperor. Only the Xiao clan's power and the new emperor's military fame kept him on his throne, Grace said, as she adjusted the clothes over my small swollen belly. Fortunately, now that you are with child, you can place your hopes on the next generation. I blinked and put on the dull smile I'd worn in Bright Moon Palace. I told her that here in Cold Peak City I had no relatives, and the emperor's temper was hard to read, so I could only rely on them to look after me. I added that with the talent selection coming and me already pregnant, I feared that when all the pretty new faces entered the palace, I might not be able to keep the emperor in Dawnlight Palace. Grace laughed, with that look seasoned servants give to the younger concubine's anxieties. Lydia, in the rear palace, rank comes from bearing sons. You are the empress. If you bear a prince, he will surely be made crown prince. Just be virtuous, fair, and not displeasing to the emperor. I nodded obediently, every inch the good listener. That night, Jenny and I watched the moon over the hill of lamps. After a long time without speaking of Bright Moon Palace, she brought up an old story. Grace is perfectly right. Bearing a son is what matters most. If they hadn't all been saying that Lady Yu was carrying a boy for certain in her second pregnancy, would you have suffered so many years of neglect? I turned and stared at her. Jenny only gazed at the lights on the hill, not sensing anything odd. She went on, recalling things from the past. It was enough to overturn my 10 years of effort in Bright Moon Palace, to show me that my imperial mother hadn't suddenly wanted me dead because I killed Isabella Liu. I had been marked for death much earlier, the moment I shattered her dream of one day being Empress Dowager. In Moonwatch Kingdom, the reigning empress had no children. The crown prince was born of a noble consort. I had known that my imperial mother had injured her root when she bore me, leaving her unable to have more children. I had not known there was more. She had been the emperor's favorite, with a powerful father high in office. All the famous doctors said her second child would be a boy. The more hopeful things looked, the more she pinned her future on it. When she saw that I was just an ordinary little girl, her disappointment was that much deeper. In the rear palace, rank comes from bearing sons. I was the one who brought her glory to a dead stop. So even if she couldn't bring herself to hate me, she would never give me the love I ought to have had. If she'd had a choice, she might have thrown me to anyone at all. Jenny, do you think they were always like this from the beginning, or did they turn this way because the palace walls are so high? Why did they all have faces of flawless beauty and hearts like snakes and scorpions? Jenny was about to answer when Alexander arrived. He asked me whether I could sleep with the lamps burning all night. I said I was not afraid of light, and if it bothered him, he could have the landscape screens moved to one side. Because I was pregnant, he only lay quietly beside me, holding me gently. When I raised my eyes, all I could see was his Adam's apple. There were so many things I wanted to ask him, but I had no faith in his answers. I dreaded that if he told me the truth I would be left speechless. My mind full of worries, I slept and had the first nightmare of my life. I dreamed of Daniel Wang. I had never seen him, so in my dream his face was a blurred version of Alexander's. I dreamed he fell from his horse into a deep swamp. Vines of dark purplish red coiled everywhere. With each step he took, black-red water oozed from under his boots, like the inside of Alexander's empty eye socket. He was trapped. At one moment, I was an onlooker watching him struggle. The next I was myself, floundering in the mire. After a while, the grass nearby stirred. A beast lunged out and fell on him, tearing at his flesh. I watched, torn between running away and helping him. Just as I hesitated, the beast turned its head toward me. Its face was human. It was my mother's face as she flung herself at me that day, screaming from the depths of her soul, "Lydia, Lydia." When Alexander woke me, my forehead was beaded with cold sweat. The mountain lamps shone, casting a mocking curl to his lips. "You're not afraid of anything, usually. What did you dream to scare you like this? Isabella come to take your life?" "I dreamed of my imperial mother. Maybe she wants mine," I answered more or less truthfully, my hand under the quilt closing very lightly on the hem of his nightrobe. Years later, I would sometimes think of that moment. If I had grabbed his hand instead, or if I had clutched at his robe more obviously, would anything have been different? But at the time, he just gave his usual scornful smile. Sometimes I really wonder what it would be like if you could live Isabella Liu's life for a while. At least if Isabella had killed Lydia, her emperor father and imperial mother would never have wanted her to pay with her life. Joke or not, it made me want to sink my teeth into his throat. I let go at once and laid my hands on my belly. From then on, I never again touched Alexander of my own accord. Not even when Jenny whispered that one of the new concubines, concubine Sophie, was the most distinguished young lady of the Shao clan, and that I would surely have a fierce struggle ahead of me, so I must by all means hold on to the emperor's heart. After so many years, I could only marvel that Jenny still kept that childlike naivete. Hearts and human feelings can be tended and kept. That is not hard. But inside such deep palace walls, who still counts as human? They were all that human-faced beast from my dream. So from the instant I laid eyes on concubine Sophie, I knew that in this cage of trapped beasts, all we'd gained was another ferocious inmate. I first saw concubine Sophie at the ceremony welcoming the new concubines. Alexander was present as well. Her greeting was the most unusual. When I was little, all I knew was calling the emperor cousin. For the past few years at home, I would even joke in private and call you cousin-in-law. I never thought we'd be addressing each other as sisters now. Sophie Xiao's brows and eyes were somewhat like Alexander's. Long and narrow, like a sly little fox. There was a rough edge to her manner that matched what I'd imagined of people from the northern deserts. Alexander tried to excuse her. She was spoiled rotten in the Duke's manor and has no filter. Don't mind her, Empress. I gazed at the smile in his eye and shook my head, only smiling myself. I had thought Alexander, like me, had no one close within these palace walls. It turned out he had his sisters and cousins, and since there had been no struggle over the throne between them, their relationships were very good. When he left, Sophie grabbed my arm and poured out tales of their childhood. How they'd climbed some palace tower together, what treasured object of the old emperor's they'd broken, where they'd planted a desert willow, how they'd played tricks on their siblings. And what about Prince Daniel? Were you close with him as well? I cut in suddenly and caught the flash of terror and hatred she didn't quite manage to hide. I spent past years in the cold palace. This is the first year I've been back for the New Year's feast. And I didn't see him. Do you know how he's been? Much the same as ever, I suppose. When we were young we played together, but once we got older, Father wouldn't let me roughhouse with my brothers. He's been at his manor these last years, only occasionally coming to the palace to visit my cousin the emperor. Her answer was watertight. She quickly shifted the topic to my pregnancy and never again mentioned Daniel. According to Grace, Daniel was 5 years younger than Alexander. The brothers had loved each other since childhood. Even crippled as he was now, Daniel's name shouldn't have been taboo in the palace, unless Alexander, like me, had personally harmed his own blood brother. There had been a properly trained heir apparent, strong in statecraft, but because his looks were marred, a less distinguished younger brother had seized his place as crown prince. Anyone with blood in his veins would have found that intolerable. The thought that he might be like me set a drum pounding in my chest. I was excited, almost giddy. It heartened me to think there might be someone else in the world as pitiful and as vile as I was. And along with that came a faint, strange stirring. When the crowd dispersed, I stood by an old willow just putting forth new buds and asked Jenny if she had ever treated anyone with true kindness. Before the palace, my parents. After the palace, my mistress. If another servant had answered so, I'd have thought her false. But Jenny was just like that, dull and steady, wholeheartedly devoted to whoever she followed. So I asked, "And you? You only ever care for others? Don't you want someone to treat you well? Aren't you afraid your kindness might be repaid with hatred?" Jenny thought very seriously about it before answering. "Sometimes I want that. Sometimes I'm afraid, but with my position, I can't demand it." The early summer winds were calm. I finally slept a little better at night, only to be plagued by pregnancy sickness. Surprisingly, even with the new concubines in the palace, Alexander came to concubine Sophie's quarters only occasionally. Most nights he stayed with me. He even had a few more rows of shelves built in the library of Dawnlight Palace. After finishing his work with the court officials, he would come there to read memorials. As Henry Lee said with a laugh, "When you bear a little prince or princess and the emperor moves back to his own study, the dust on that desk will be as thick as his palm." Sometimes, watching him bent over his work, seriously annotating documents in the warm lamplight, I felt a strange daze. The light softened his sharp features. From the side, with his one good eye, he looked as though he'd been a quiet young man once. Were they always like this from the start? I wondered silently, or did the deep palace walls change them? I remembered suddenly that I had asked Jenny that very question. Before I could think it through, Alexander said, "Lydia, what do you think of my plans to expand our northern borders?" Seeing my confusion, he added, "I hear your Moonwatch princesses read history and essays from childhood. I want to hear your thoughts. Don't be nervous. Just say what you think." Though I'd come as a bride of peace, I had always scoffed at such marriages. And beauty brings calamity? Men fought over the world, and when they won or lost, they blamed it on women. It was shameless. So I wasn't afraid of saying something that might make Alexander decide to march on Moonwatch again. I spoke plainly. Snowsteppe may be vast, but it lies in the far north and is not suited to farming. Agriculture is your weakness. If you can take the 16 fertile border cities of Moonwatch, that would be a great boon. There's no need to push further south. First, deep incursions are hard to hold over time. Second, the distance would cause too much attrition of troops. I kept my head down, embroidering a tiny belly band for the baby. It was only when I realized the hall had gone very still that I looked up. He was staring, eyes lit with an intensity I had never seen before. "Lydia," he said. After a moment he smiled. He opened his mouth as if to say something more, but only repeated, "Lydia?" He sat there watching me, smiling for a long time, before he dropped his gaze and went back to his paperwork. It was only my name, 2 simple syllables, but somehow it felt as though I heard 10,000 unsaid words, all hidden in his shadow stretched long by the candlelight. The night wind was still. For the first time, the eve bells outside sounded piercingly loud, and the sea of lamps on the hill seemed unbearably bright, and his smile was sharply, strikingly handsome. After mid-autumn, my body grew heavier. My belly was round and high. Every physician who saw me said I was carrying twins. Curled up in Alexander's arms, I frowned in pain, thinking of the births I had seen in Bright Moon Palace. One child was a trip to the gates of hell. What would 2 be like? So I told him that if I had a hard labor, he should take my life and cut my belly open, take the children out, and raise them himself. That way, I would be free of suffering. Jenny let out a startled cry. Alexander covered my mouth with his hand. "After you give birth and recover, I'll properly punish you for that remark." The children came at term. The snow that day was blinding. Pines as thick as a man's body bent under the weight of it, their tops hanging over the mountainside. Pain burned through every limb. Between one wave and the next, looking past the screens, I could just make out several blurred but familiar faces. Sophie Shao had already been promoted to Consort Sophie. She kept her eyes on her tea, while Natalie Liu craned her neck to peer toward my bed. The other concubines sat where they were, some sneaking glances at the emperor, some stiff and uneasy. The ordeal lasted until late at night. They truly were twins. The first was a princess. When Grace brought the second to me, I heard her say, "Congratulations, Lydia, on the birth of Dragon Phoenix twins." And then I lost consciousness. It was the second dream of my life that I could recall. In it, I was very small, and our emperor father and imperial mother held my hands, leading me up onto Pomegranate Terrace. I wore a dress brighter than the blossoms as I danced, and they praised me as the fairest, finest little princess in Bright Moon Palace. The sky spun, the ground tilted, and suddenly I was in my red bridal dress stepping into Dawnlight Palace. Alexander and I were performing Snowsteppe's highest rites of emperor and empress, and he treated me with marked respect. The first words he spoke were, "Empress, you may rise." When I woke, the world had turned upside down. Alexander was sitting at my bedside and immediately asked how I felt. I hurt all over, as if I'd been torn between 5 horses. I said I wanted to see the children. He paused, and in the backlight I saw him lower his head. Grace brought my little princess first. It was Henry Lee who spoke next. "Hurry and have the nurse bring the little prince from Huiro Palace so the empress may see him." My hand froze over my daughter's cheek. I turned to look at Alexander. His head dipped even lower. "You have worked hard, Empress, to bear my eldest son and eldest daughter," he said softly. It was the first time I had seen him so lacking in his usual swagger. He took my hand in both of his, and I noticed his palms were slick with cold sweat. "I have named the prince Edward." For peace and prosperity, I pushed myself half upright, struggling. He knew I wanted to see his face, and so deliberately turned, giving me only the cold half shrouded by the eye patch. "So you sent our newborn son to Consort Sophie's care in Huiro Palace before I had even seen his face?" The mistress of Huiro Palace was Sophie Shao. "Empress." At last he faced me. His brows were knitted into a dead knot. I waited for an explanation, but all he said was a feeble, "Mind your manners." Gooseflesh prickled up my arms. I must have been blind with rage, because I leaned down and bit his hand as hard as I could. I wanted a piece of flesh, but in my weakness I could not even draw blood. He didn't push me away. He let me gnaw at him, my mouth full of the taste of iron, my face wet with tears. The tolerance and pity in his eyes ground what little dignity I had left to dust. When Eddie was brought in, the hall fell silent. At the sight of his sleeping face, I suddenly remembered that dream of Daniel being torn apart by the beast. He had worn features similar to Alexander's, with bright eyes that reflected sky and clouds. I broke down, sobbing loudly. My crying woke Eddie. He began to wail in his swaddling clothes. Alexander ordered the nurse to take him back to Hero Palace. I strangled the wild impulse to snatch him back and glared at Alexander instead. He's only just been born. You are heartless. Even knowing that in this deep palace he would not escape bloody storms for power and status, it still seemed cruel to make him a pawn while he was so small, to grow up in another woman's arms while his real mother lived just a wall away. Worse still, if they had waited until I woke to consult me, perhaps I might have agreed out of reason. But he was too lofty to consider my feelings at all. He stared back at me, the last of his forbearance evaporating. This is my harem. If I place him at another consort's side, can I not protect him? You couldn't even protect your own eye. How can you protect a helpless infant? I shouted until my voice nearly broke. I saw the shock and hurt in his face burn away his self-control. Princess Lydia, he spat, eyes reddening, hammering at my heart with every word. What right do you have to lecture me? In Bright Moon City you were as low as an ant. Here in Cold Peak you are less than that. Without my protection, you are nothing. Do you understand? For a moment it was as though time rolled back to when he'd first released me from the cold palace. He loomed over me, fingers digging into my wrists, reminding me at every turn that whether as an insect or a plaything, I was never a person in anyone's eyes. Ridiculous that I had once pinned some faint hope on him. I had hoped that whatever true feeling Alexander gave me might fill the ravine in my heart, put forth shoots, and eventually bloom. But that seed rotted in the dark earth right then and there. If that is why you quietly sent Eddie to consort Sophie, then I understand. I wiped my tears, and with them, wiped away many scattered feelings. I struggled to slide from the bed and knelt. I told him he had worked hard for my sake in recent days, and I urged him to return to his duties and not delay state affairs. Before he could justify himself, I cut him off. I respectfully send you off. That made this the third time I had told him to go. He helped me back up. I kept my eyes fixed on the hem of his yellow robe. In the end, I heard a heavy sigh, then footsteps fading, crossing the threshold, and disappearing outside the palace gate. That was the coldest New Year I had ever lived through, even though Alexander, as usual, kept the vigil with me in Dawnlight Palace. Even though he ordered the nurse to bring Eddie to me for 3 whole days before taking him back. When the fireworks burst and the hill lamps blazed, no brilliance could return things to what they had been. I had not expected Sophie to come and see me of her own accord. The winter plum was in full bloom. She brought only one maid and a white jade vase, and had Jenny cut a few branches to arrange by my window so they could bloom for days. She did not circle around. Leaning close, she said outright, "You need not resent me, nor fear that I will treat the elder prince ill." I looked at her then. I envied her for that unshakable confidence I had never had. I spoke just as plainly. "I have never resented you. In this walled-in world, few can do as they please. At this moment, I'm not afraid of anything. If there's fear to be had, it's you who should fear what happens when your prince comes of age." Sophie blinked. Her fox eyes curved like natural seduction. Even put against Isabella Liu, she would steal the light. She didn't hide her admiration. She said I looked dull and timid, but my mind was clear. She told me I never had to be afraid. I didn't understand. Watching her leisurely play with her fingernails, I asked, "Why?" "The emperor doesn't dare let any woman of the Shao clan bear him a child. He's had the incense in my rooms mixed with something that prevents conception. He thinks I don't know." For some reason, in that instant I saw Alexander's face before me, his promise that he could keep Eddie safe. I did not dare guess how much of that had been for my sake. When I asked why she hadn't made a scandal of it, my younger self couldn't read the strange smile on Sophie's lips. She didn't explain. Only repeated, "So long as you no longer worry on my account, that's enough. I will raise the elder prince well and use all the Shao clan's power to help him into the Eastern Palace and one day onto the throne." I clapped a hand over her mouth. The palace walls had ears, and Alexander was barely past 30. To discuss a new emperor already was terrifying. But the little fox only smiled and gripped my hand instead, eyes full of meaning. She knew she had me. I believed her, and I had begun, almost without knowing it, to protect her. In such a situation, I could do nothing else. By reason and by feeling, I had to shield her. After she left, Jenny fretted about what Sophie was planning, saying it wasn't enough that she'd taken my son, now she wanted me on a leash as well. I looked at the plum blossoms in the vase. All the ground outside was white with snow, but those blossoms burned bright red. Like Sophie herself, always the most dazzling flower in this cold-bound city. I told Jenny. She came to tell me that, to reassure me, I've accepted the favor. One day I'll have to pay it back. Though I didn't yet know what Sophie was planning, it was clear that I still had value to her. If not, with the Xiao clan's power at its height, she'd never have bothered to see me at all. Perhaps because she'd given me that reassurance, I softened somewhat toward Alexander. At night, when he tried to hold me from behind, I no longer shrank away. He only hugged me tighter, strong arms wrapped around me, his breath warm at my ear as he asked, "You don't hate me anymore?" I kept silent a long time before answering, "I never hated you. I've seen as much palace filth as you have. I was only afraid, that's all. Please understand that." "I do," he said, laughing softly. "No one has ever pulled open my scars and cursed me like that. It proves you aren't afraid of death. I've never seen you afraid of anything. I thought it was strange. In the end, flesh and blood still binds you. You're not above it all. One thing isn't another. That day, dragging out your old wound was my fault." I turned to face him, heart to heart. I didn't know if it was moonlight or lamplight brightening everything. It wasn't bad manners, it was me hurting you. He met my eyes. Since that day, he had never again taken off his eye patch. Now he raised a hand and unfastened it. I saw once more that dark marsh. "Even back then," he murmured, and I could not tell whose heartbeat was thundering louder, his or mine. "Even back then, if they could have apologized to me as you just did, for hurting my heart, they might not have come to such an end." I knew he meant his younger brother Daniel, and his late mother Empress Dowager Charlotte Jiao. Grace had told me that when the Empress Dowager had one of her frequent spells, an attendant sent to fetch the physicians never returned. When they arrived the next noon, they were too late to cure her illness. She died soon after. When I asked if his eye had also been their doing, he shot me a half-amused, half-bitter look. "As for this eye, it does have something to do with you, Lydia." I had thought that everything about Isabella Liu had fallen away with her death. I hadn't expected the threads to remain tangled in my life for 4 or 5 years. Alexander had lost his eye because of that accident in Bright Moon Palace when he was playing with Isabella. The fall had torn the corner of his eye beyond repair. Eventually, it went blind. Everyone said he was infatuated with her, which was why he insisted on marrying her as empress. Only when I saw the fury and hatred in his eyes did I realize that he had wanted to marry her to punish her, to repay his blind eye. Just as he had wanted to punish me at first. "So that's why, the instant you saw it was me and not Isabella, you were enraged and sent me to the cold palace?" I asked. He smiled, anger still flickering in his face, making him look almost wild. "And that's why, the moment I heard you'd killed her, I had you brought back. When I heard you'd poisoned her so she bled from every orifice, the thought alone pleased me." "Lydia, you really are a treasure." He pulled me into his arms. I could hear his heart hammering under my ear, stirred by his own words. I almost laughed. For killing Isabella, I had been condemned by all. Who would have thought someone might applaud? He stroked my back again and again as if I were a favored cat. Alexander and I were so alike, and at our core, not alike at all. I lifted my hands to stroke his back in turn. "So all those rumors in the 5 kingdoms about you spurning women are wrong. You're just like a man bitten by a snake once, afraid of every rope afterward." "Not so," he said, resting his chin on my hair. Our heartbeats seemed to be ringing in unison. "I was just waiting, that's all. Waiting for someone I could love to appear, Lydia. Waiting for you, Lydia." For no good reason, I wanted to cry. And I wanted to laugh. He should have fallen in love with someone like Sophie. A true equal, a match in wits and will. Whether they loved or hated each other, both could stand tall, without regret. But Alexander was a madman. He had fallen for his plaything. From the start, this feeling was wrong. Love between a man and a woman cannot thrive in a relationship as uneven as ours. In the histories, there were always strange emperors. Alexander was surely one. In the almost 6 years I had been in the palace, while Eddie and Clara were already toddling and talking, he had still only ever slept with me. That must have been part of why Sophie found me useful, because affection is always a ruler's soft spot. She even joked in private that he was keeping himself chaste for my sake. Even as a mother of 2, I still felt shy and scolded her for talking such nonsense at her age. "Consort Sophie speaks sense," Natalie chimed in. With my protection, her days were far better than other concubines. She had come to accept her lot and was living boldly. The emperor only spent 1 night in my palace, and all that time he just asked about Bright Moon Palace and about the empress. Heaven and earth can bear witness, that night was like an official reading reports on state affairs. How does that count as favor? Everyone laughed. Natalie grew more animated. It's known to all the court that the emperor has spent the night in only 3 palaces. And the 3 of us are all sitting here together to watch the lotuses bloom. Speaking of these lotus blossoms, they are all thanks to Bright Moon Palace, she added, pointing toward the lake. They say you once had a lotus pond in your courtyard there. You liked it very much, so the emperor ordered this built for you specially. Look at that 8-sided rain-cherished pavilion in the center, just like the ones back home. My interest stirred. I had the servants move our tea and fruit to the pavilion so we could enjoy the flowers up close. I had to admit, few emperors in history had ever treated their empresses so lavishly. And I felt guilty. Besides helping him steady the palace harem, I had done nothing much for him. Or rather, nothing I could do truly mattered to him. It seemed that the desire to be needed had become an obsession in me since childhood. As Jenny depended on me, as Natalie submitted to me, as Sophie saw me as a tool, I felt needed. But to Alexander, I was not needed like that. Lost in such thoughts, I didn't notice the rain begin outside the pavilion. Raindrops pattered on lotus leaves. Mist rose in veils, turning the scene into Bright Moon Palace all over again. And I heard Natalie murmur, "I miss home. It takes more than a month for letters to go and come back. I don't even know if our emperor father and imperial mother are well." I could not fathom such feelings until Alexander appeared on the lakeshore with the children. For once he wasn't wearing imperial yellow. He had on a simple spring blue robe. He carried Clara in one arm and held Eddie's hand with the other. Through the rain curtain I saw him say something, and then heard both children call out, "Mother!" Alexander smiled at me from afar. I stared, dazed. A feeling unlike any I had ever known burst open in my chest, sweet and warm, steeped in bitterness and helplessness. "Lydia, do you want to give them the best life you can?" Sophie's voice drifted at my ear, blurred like dream speech. "I would die for that," I answered. The sky let loose a downpour, smudging the figures on the shore into ghostly shapes. In Cold Peak City, I had no one to rely on. Most news of the court came to me through Sophie or Grace. In the end, they were both Xiao clan people. Grace had followed the late Empress Dowager Charlotte Xiao into the palace as a maid, planted at my side from long ago. They told me that ever since I'd borne the prince, voices complaining about a one-eyed emperor had risen again. No doubt the Xiao clan was stirring the pot. They had backed Daniel in the beginning. The late Empress Dowager had been Duke Xiao's beloved younger sister. Her early death, brought on by delayed treatment, must have been laid at Alexander's door. He hadn't been to the harem in some time. The lamps in his study burned till dawn night after night. By late autumn that year, when I finally saw him again, he was visibly thinner. That bright, feral man looked worn and dull. He leaned against the couch as usual and took off his eye patch without a word. Then, unexpectedly, he asked, "Lydia, do you know why I haven't fathered more children?" I brewed tea for him and answered softly, "You fear the brothers would fight in future. Now it is to be father and son fighting." My heart jumped. I turned to look at him. In the window's warm light, he was so still he might have been a skeleton propped against the cushions. I forced my voice calm. "No one born to an imperial house has an easy road." I looked away before he could turn. focusing again on the tea. He stared at me a long while before asking the question that made my heart tremble. If it came to what happened between you and your sister, between me and Eddie, what would you do? That would depend on whether you killed Eddie or Eddie killed you, I said, bowing to set the tea before him. My eyes stayed fixed on the silver tassels hanging from the couch. Lydia. He didn't touch the tea. He seized my wrist instead, and hot tea nearly spilled over. I was going to ask more, but I don't dare. He called Henry Lee in and, still gripping my wrist, issued an edict proclaiming the elder Prince Eddie as crown prince and sending him to the Eastern Palace. I jerked my head up, startled, to find his gaze cold as ever. Looking down on me, he spoke in a tone that had never allowed refusal. We will speak no more of politics tonight. I intend to sleep properly for once. Empress, there's no poison in this tea, is there? I laughed without sound and reached for the cup, but he snagged it first and drained it. Then he scooped me up and tossed me onto the bed. He came to lie beside me, never letting go of my hand. Half asleep that night, I heard his murmur. Why didn't you poison me? Killing Isabella Lou had been a dead-end gamble. I had thrown my life against hers. But, Alex, here in Cold Peak City, those who can move against you are many besides me. To stake my life and yours on one throw is a bad bargain. It was my first time looking down on Alexander from above, like drinking poison to quench thirst and sweet as honey. When the edict spreading news of the new crown prince went through the palace, Sophie was astonished. She asked what I had said or done to Alexander. I repeated my words to her, leaving out only the last part about him sleeping well that night. She echoed me, testing each word. That would depend on whether the Emperor killed Eddie or Eddie killed the Emperor. Leaning close enough that our faces nearly touched, she said, Now I think I see what the Emperor is so obsessed with in you. Even I find myself a little bewitched by you. I spat at her. Have you thought of men so much you're looking at women now? She laughed. Clearly my gentle push had thrilled her. The crown prince's investiture had satisfied the Xiao clan at last. I happened to recall that Emperor Taizong of Snowstep had taken the throne at 7. The thought left me shaken, though I couldn't show it. They liked seeing me simple and biddable. Even when I spoke daggers that pierced Alexander's heart, they only thought I was too blunt for my own good. Look at me, I later said to Jenny when no one else was there. All I have to do is be myself, and everyone relaxes their guard. They think I'm an easy fool to handle. She protested that I wasn't a fool. I told her that in this palace, only fools lived comfortably. As I said it, I couldn't help glancing at Jenny. I didn't know when she had become Aunt Jenny, the one all the servants of Dawnlight Palace deferred to. Watching her, still as wooden as ever, I felt my hair stand on end. Hadn't I always believed Jenny to be the only fool in this whole mess? But what fool survives flawlessly in 2 royal palaces in 2 kingdoms? What fool hits my sore spots again and again, only to steer away and make me think it was coincidence? This really was an eating ground for ghosts. The towering red walls enclosed a realm of demons. Everywhere I looked, there were only phantoms and ghouls. I had thought that once Eddie was made crown prince, we could have a little peace. But after only 3 years, there were already whispers of a new ruler. Eddie had just turned 6. Alexander was serious about training him as heir. That half-tall child could recite dozens of histories from the 5 kingdoms, leaving me gaping. Don't give the Emperor all the credit, Sophie said, teasing me. I've put a lot of effort into him as well. How could I forget? All 3 of the Crown Prince's tutors came from the Xiao clan, and even his martial instructor had been a retainer of Sophie's mother's family. By all signs, the Xiao clan was slowly hollowing out Alexander's power. They meant to set Eddie on the throne, and Alexander, as ruthless and mad as he'd ever been, was hardly the sort to sit and wait for execution. Sure enough, just after the new year, he decreed that since the crown prince had now learned to ride and hunt, he would bring him along to that year's spring hunt. As I panicked, trying to secure an audience, Alexander was faster. He came to Dawnlight Palace himself. He took his time finishing a cup of tea. The last threads of sunset gilded his one good eye and his smile into something dazzling. Empress, I've never taken you to a spring hunt before. Would you like to see it for yourself this time? He held out his hand to me. It was empty, but I seemed to see the hilt of a knife in it. I thought of that dream, of the beast in the bog. Only this time, I knew someone else might be the one sinking. Sophie begged to be taken along, and pestered Alexander until he had her confined to her palace in irritation. With things so far gone, she stopped pretending and sent Grace to summon me, insisting she had to see me before we left the palace. With her, things were just as I'd expected. She told me about Daniel, and said Alexander had crippled his own brother for the throne. The ever-smooth young lady sat with her head bowed, the butterfly pin in her hair casting fluttering shadows. Suddenly, I understood many things. How she knew the incense made her barren, and yet never raised a fuss. How she could promise so calmly to raise Eddie to manhood. Why the Xiao clan had backed Daniel with such determination. And why his name had been the one thing she never dared speak. Because the most proud and overbearing young lady in the Duke's manor had always been in love with her little cousin. It must have been a fine childhood love, the brightest girl in the realm, matched with the future emperor. Everything should have been happy, but Alexander had broken it with his own hands. Her youth's sweetheart was reduced to a ruin. She even had to marry the man who had done it. Of course she would want to bring down his throne, make him pay, make his life's work a hollow dream. That left me no choice. She urged me again and again to stop Alexander, saying the Xiao clan was determined. I could only stand behind Eddie. As she left, I placed my hand gently on the back of Sophie's head, as I did when soothing Clara to sleep. She looked up at me, and suddenly, tears spilled down her cheeks. She sat at the table while I stood at her side. She put both arms around my waist and hid her face in my lap, sobbing as she asked, "Why is it like this? Why? Why? Why had everything started out so good, only for everyone to change beyond recognition? Why did the innocent never get a peaceful end, and the guilty never seem to find joy? Why, when we both stood at the pinnacle of a kingdom's power, were we forced to wear masks of contentment, dragging ourselves forward on fear and hatred? We neither wanted to live nor dared to die." On the days of the spring hunt, Alexander had both Eddie and me stay in his personal tent. He told me that years ago, when he traveled in disguise, he had once lodged with border peasants. Whole families of several people shared a single hut. The husband worked for wages by day, the wife ran the household. Because they were so poor, they tended to have only one wife and one child of each sex. "Just like us," he said as he poured me a cup of clear wine and put a dish in front of me. "It's a pity there's no precedent for bringing princesses on the hunt. If Clara were here, the family would be complete." Except for the yellow of his robes, this might have been an ordinary little family's day. Eddie was not yet 7, but he had the bearing of a crown prince. He sat below us, watching curiously but not daring to speak. I couldn't help laughing. "Do you want to try the wine?" He was too young to drink, but at my teasing he turned to his father. Alexander, forever more indulgent of me than of Eddie, deliberately turned his head away as if not seeing anything. Even so, the clear wine had a bite to it. Eddie coughed and spluttered, eyes watering. I rubbed his back, laughing. "Where's the dignity of our crown prince? Crying and sniffling like this in front of everyone?" Embarrassed and angry, Eddie bowed and hurried out to wash and change. I turned back slowly and realized that Alexander had been watching silently the whole time, his one eye smiling like a crescent moon. I thought then that he could laugh like that while planning to have his own son killed. Just like I once laughed while handing my sister poisoned lychees. Even Jenny had pitied me back then. Here and now, Alexander was no different from the girl I had been, only he meant to kill my Eddie, not even 7 years old yet. I could not pity him. Whoever had pitied Alexander? Would Henry Lay? I doubted it. That old eunuch had seen too many dynasties rise and fall. At most, he would sigh that winners became kings and losers, outlaws. "When do you plan to go into the mountains to hunt?" I asked, and he knew what I was really asking. "Tomorrow at noon," he said, still smiling. "The crown prince will stay in camp under Henry's care." I froze, watching him hold out his hand. "Will you keep me company?" No one had foreseen that instead of dragging Eddie into the mountains, he would bring me. Though it was spring, the northern air was still bitter. I did not ride. Instead, he took me up behind him. Safe behind his broad back, I wasn't flayed by the knife-edge wind. The place he led me to was just like my dream. Only the dried, hard ground had no sucking mire. Tall dead grass rose chest high. I saw nothing at first, only Alexander suddenly take aim and loose an arrow. The soldiers following us rushed forward, then returned with a rabbit. Their boots had flattened a narrow path through the grass. Alexander said that as children, he and Daniel had followed that little track, and that beyond a cave there had been a spring where they'd once seen a rare white deer. "Empress, would you like to take a risk with me?" he asked, jumping down and strapping the bow across his back. He looked up at me, face bright with boyish excitement. Like someone in a trance, I let him help me down. I let him take my hand and push aside the tall grass. He ordered the soldiers to follow at a distance and not come near. Just as he'd said, we found a cave. I slipped several times and only his steady arms kept me from falling. On the far side, more tall grass blocked our view. Fear brushed ice-cold fingers across my neck. I tugged on his hand. He turned back to me and suddenly asked the question he had once bitten back. "What if I killed Eddie? What if Eddie killed me?" I looked up, stunned. My lips moved soundlessly. No words would come. He smiled then, lightly, with a strange touch of youth in it. He patted my hand as if he hadn't spoken at all. "Wait here. I'll clear a path and come back for you." He took off the bow and moved forward, hacking through the stalks. As he went, he said, "That year, Daniel and I followed a deer here. I was like you, afraid of the long grass and the dark, but he wouldn't listen and plunged ahead. When he called for help, I thought he was playing tricks like when we were little. Then I saw a tiger's tail, as thick as my arm, sweep past, and knew he was in real danger, and ran with the guards. It hadn't been an attempt at murder. Their life together had been good. As the elder prince, he'd been raised as the heir. Daniel had been his most beloved brother. Even when his eye was injured and the court tried to set Daniel up as crown prince instead, he hadn't really blamed him. But though it had been an accident, once they returned to the palace, everyone pointed at him, calling him a fratricide. With their hearts caked in rot, those palace people saw malice in everything. His eye had not needed to be taken, it had only been blind. He could still have looked whole to anyone at a glance. But when Empress Dowager Charlotte heard that her little son would be crippled for life, she had been so enraged that she ordered his blind eye ripped out. Mother told me that even if I had 10 eyes to give, it wouldn't be enough to repay Daniel. His voice cracked. I knelt in the grass, tears blurring everything. His shoulders looked so narrow, it seemed a few weeds could punch straight through them. It wasn't the eye that hurt most. What truly hurt was knowing that she hated me so, yet to keep her position as Empress Dowager, she had to keep me alive and pretend we were a loving mother and son. When I was young, I thought Daniel was only coddled because he came late in her life. I thought because father treated me as heir, they just had to be stricter with me. But when it came to real trouble, I learned I wasn't the favored one. No one believed me. Not one. Father died of anger, unable to close his eyes. Mother saw me as an enemy. Later, when I went to see Daniel, he believed I had meant to hurt him. He fell from his chair and crawled to drive me out. And as for Mother's last illness, she had been sick for years. That time I was only sulking. I never thought it would be that serious. I never meant for her to die. Alexander turned and looked at me through the grass, his face streaming with tears. He frowned and rasped, "Lydia, why?" The wind roared over the hills. I had no answers, for Jenny, for Sophie, or for him. He began to move backward through the grass, never taking his eyes from mine. As he went, he straightened his crown and put on that manic imperial grandeur he had shown me the first time we met. "You would hollow out my power, crown Eddie in my place, make me some so-called retired emperor?" His laughter was bitter and cold. Since my accession, I've expanded Snow Steppes' borders several times, built roads and canals, encouraged farming, and worked for the people's prosperity and the realm's future. The historians would have named me one of the great rulers of all ages. And you want me to be a puppet, waiting to die? Traitors, dream on. A wild gust swept over us. The path he'd opened closed up in a swirl of bent stems. In an instant, I could no longer see his back. Terror tore at my scalp. I fought my way forward, grass scoring my face and hands with shallow cuts. I screamed his name like a mad woman. "Alex! Alex! Alexander!" Alexander. When the blizzard hit, the soldiers and I finally clawed our way through. He had fallen from a low cliff to the edge of a spring, his body coated in mud, pierced through and through by dead branches. Sliding and scrambling down, I rolled the last few feet and dragged his thin body into my arms. When I turned him over, I saw a slender dead branch lodged in his empty socket. Just as I had joked the first time, he took off his eye patch, that if I drove a sharpened stick in there, it would pierce through his head like a skewer of candied haw. It was all fate. Darkness surged at the edges of my sight. I heard him speak through a mouthful of blood. "Lydia, you're just as partial as they were." My heart seized. It was as if a beast had gouged that deep hole in my chest even deeper. In that instant, I finally understood why I had never pitied Alexander, because to him, I was now what my emperor father and imperial mother had been to me. At last, I had become the person I once dreamed of killing, spurring an innocent man down a blind alley to his death. The last words he spoke to me were, "You're just like them. You never believed I truly meant to treat you well." "I do believe it," I whispered. "I even felt something for you." He died before the words left my mouth. His strong fingers slackened. My tears fell onto his face, streaked with mud and blood. But I went on anyway, as if afraid he would otherwise die unknowing. But Alex, love from so high above can only breed hatred in my heart. The sky spun, the earth reeled. Clutching Alexander's cooling body, I finally fainted. In the 11th year of his reign, the young emperor, not yet 40, died in the arms of the empress he loved most. The rest of my life was quite good. Before I was 30, I was Empress Dowager of Snowstep. When there was nothing urgent, I invited Natalie and Sophie over to sip tea and watch the flowers. I never told anyone how Alexander had died. I only said that we'd been chasing a deer when a sudden snowstorm hid the cliff edge under grass. Running ahead, he hadn't seen it and slipped, falling to his death. Somehow, rumor twisted the tale so that it became me who had pestered him into hunting deeper in the mountains. Sophie thought I had helped her get rid of Alexander, and so she always made sure I stayed Empress Dowager, sheltering me in public and in secret. But power in the hands of ministers is never stable. Eddie had been shrewd since he was a child. As he grew, he raised his own faction of officials against the Xiao clan. In the end, he extinguished their dominance. While Alexander had lived, I would never have believed that Duke Xiao would one day retire in peace. Eddie once spoke of his father voluntarily, which was rare. Father wanted to do the same. If he had not died so early and had had 20 more years to plot as I did, he would have ended in the same place. So it was not only to me. Even to Eddie, Alexander had been good. Yes, in the blink of an eye, my Eddie had grown to the age Alexander had been when we first met. Clara had married a consort she liked and borne 2 sons and a daughter. Even the youngest could toddle around me, calling grandmother Empress. By all reason, it was a happy life. For someone like me, for a life like mine. One winter evening, I sat before my mirror, staring blankly. A sharp flash of light snapped me awake. I turned automatically and stopped Jenny's hand as she reached for the curtain. Wait until bedtime to lower them. It was the lamps on the hill, blazing as they had when I first asked for them. The moon was dim and gray, but Dawnlight Palace was bright as noon. So ridiculous. Even in the will he drafted early, Alexander had been partial to me. He'd granted me this palace to live in alone until the end of my days and decreed that the Lamp Mountain must never be dismantled, that everything was to remain as it was. I walked to the window and tilted my head back, staring at the sea of lanterns. When I dropped my gaze, my face was wet with tears. Because the one who had once stood beside me under this mountain of light was gone. The man who had stood in the snow like a plume of flame, who had delighted in scaring me, in seeing through me, and who was the only one ever to love me, would never appear again. In the end, he didn't receive love from anyone. In this place, the mad are often the simplest. The things he wanted had never been his to have. In the end, it was all a dream. Yellow millet yet uncooked. In the end, the deep palace was his grave.